Hi everyone, welcome to Here We Are, Brattleboro's Community Talk Show. I'm Wendy O'Connell, and my guest today is HB Lozito. HB has lived in Brattleboro for about 8 years, since 2011. They worked for Building Green. Also, they were an organizer for the local LGBT community here in town, and then went on to lead Green Mountain Crossroads. HB is also serving as a Brattleboro Town Rep in District 2. Welcome, HB.
Thank you, Wendy. It's so nice to be here with you.
Yeah, it's great to have you on the show today. We have a lot to talk about.
Yes, yeah, I know. Our half-hour time limit is going to go by quickly.
And the clock is ticking. So we'll go quickly. Early years, you grew up in Maine, and you grew up way up in Bangor, Maine, which has even more snow than we do.
Yes.
And you also, at a pretty early age, as a teen, you got interested in farming and sustainability.
Yeah, so I grew up in Hamden, Maine, which is just south of Bangor. My mom's family is many generations on Montessori Island. I'm the only person actually on that side of my family who's not living in Maine right now, so I always feel a little bit of guilt and sadness about our landlockedness. Although, leading to sustainability, right, who knows? The oceans are creeping ever closer towards our Vermont borders.
You could be on the coastline.
Could be on the coastline. Yeah, and I think, I grew up always having an interest in being outside and running around in the woods behind my mom's house and all that kind of stuff. And I went away to college in the Pacific Northwest and studied environmental studies and biology and chemistry, geology and politics. And after my first summer in college, came back to Maine and started farming with my sister through an apprenticeship program of the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association. So really got interested in it then. There's a ton of towns up in that area that all have names like Freedom, Unity, Friendship, that as a child I always had assumed were like back to the land hippies. And it turns out they're actually Revolutionary War names. Oh,
Revolutionary War.
Which is very interesting.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Then you came way south to Brattleboro.
After about 10 years on the West Coast, I did. Some friends whose moving truck I actually drove here from San Francisco up the windy roads of Brattleboro had bought a house here. One of those folks grew up in near Stowe, Vermont, and had moved back here and said, we've got a large home that needs some folks to live in it. So that's why I arrived in Brattleboro.
Oh, that's a way, not always, but I often ask people how they got here. And for anybody my age or around my age, it's almost always involving a Volkswagen.
Yeah.
Right? And farming, too.
Yes.
So it's nice to have the farming happening again. So you started with Building Green at some point and working with them.
They're a great company, and in the first year that I lived here, I would meet people, or when family of mine would come to visit, my mom would say, "Oh, my kid works for Building Green," and people would say, "How did they get that job? That's amazing!" And I learned so much working there, and had a really excellent experience
nice.
Working with them. Part of my work was in leading and pulling together a summit of folks from large architecture firms who are working in sustainability from around the U.S. and pulling those people together, and that was a really exciting part of my job there. So
you have been you were a bit of an organizer before Green Mountain Crossroads.
Yeah, I think that's always been something that I've been drawn to since I was a very young person. My mom, actually, one of the first things I remember her bringing me to was like an anti-sweatshop fashion show that she was in. I maybe was 10 or 11.
That's early.
Yeah, and I just remember thinking like, learning about what that meant and about ethically produced clothing, and I think that really got me interested in political organizing, and did a lot of that in high school and on up through then. Yeah.
Started young.
Yeah.
Started young. And so Green Mountain Crossroads, how did you get introduced to that?
So I came to Green Mountain Crossroads in 2014, but had been doing some work as you mentioned in the intro, with LGBTQ folks here in Brattleboro really since I moved here. I moved in January, and in April, I and some friends put on a hip hop show with a trans hip hop artist that we knew, mostly because I had been farming in Maine, but right before that had been living in the San Francisco Bay Area, where there's a very large population of LGBTQ people, and that felt really important to me personally, to have that kind of community. But it also felt important to move back and live in a rural place. And so, wanting to have both of those things together. So when I arrived here in Brattleboro, I was saying to myself, I know there are queer people here, but where are they? There was some great programming happening through the men's program, which was a project of the AIDS Project of Southern Vermont. And many other people for many, many decades have been doing LGBTQ community organizing here. And so figuring out how to access those communities as someone who was newer to Brattleboro was challenging and easy at various times. So
you didn't have history, so you could knock on doors.
Yes. So we started putting on shows under the name Homo Promo, which I'm still very fond of.
That's a great name.
Yeah, and people responded really positively, and including folks at the AIDS Project, and that's initially how I got connected with Green Mountain Crossroads. Folks at the men's program said, we really love what you're doing. This is so important, bringing people together. And most of their audience was older gay men, and a lot of the folks that were coming to our programming were younger LGBTQ people of all identities. And so we had a really great collaboration at the beginning and throughout. And so when folks started Green Mountain Crossroads, I had already been doing the Homo Promo work, and they said, can you step in and take this on as well?
I think that's kind of amazing that you had a pretty established older community and also a younger community coming together and working together.
Yes, and I think that's something that's very unique and special about doing work in a rural place, because I found, when you're in a city, you can really narrow down the type of people that you're interacting with and have, a huge party with only people that match exactly your own demographics.
Yes.
And for all kinds of reasons, we're not able to do that here in smaller places. I think that's a real opportunity for us. A lot of the work that we do at Green Mountain Crossroads is very intergenerational, and I think that's really special and powerful.
Let's hear about Green Mountain Crossroads and what you guys do.
Yes. Yeah. Green Mountain Crossroads, we're based here in Brattleboro. We started in 2013. I came in 2014, and all of our work is focused around the intersection of ruralness and LGBTQ identities. So we do a lot of different programming. Some of it is much more traditional social service, things like referring people to LGBTQ competent therapists and medical providers, connecting people with those types of resources. We're doing some work with Brattleboro Memorial Hospital right now on helping them continue to be up to speed with caring for LGBTQ patients. But a lot of the other kinds of work that we do is much more creative in a different and broader way. And really, again, exploring that fundamental intersection. So we do things like long-form oral history projects, like our Andrews Inn Oral History Project.
Which we'll hear about in a few minutes.
Yes. We've been working on that for about 5 years. We have a number of ongoing social support groups that are peer-led. We run what we call Trans Femme Chill Club, for people who are assigned male at birth and want space only to be with people who have a trans woman and feminine experience. We just started a new group for people interested in polyamory and non-monogamy. In collaboration with Outright Vermont, we have a monthly group for LGBTQ youth. So there's those kinds of things. In collaboration, we do a lot of collaborating. I often find myself saying in collaboration with
and partnerships.
Yes, folks at Lost River Racial Justice and the Root Social Justice Centers, Black, Indigenous, and People of Color Caucus. We run a rural racial justice organizing study group that's looking at how are people organizing around racial justice in rural places. And then sort of what I think of as our flagship event is our Out in the Open Summit, which happens every fall. That's 2.5 days for folks to come together and do hands-on things, what I think of as rural living skills, like goat care and cheese making and chainsaw safety and butchery, as well as deep discussions about what is life like as a rural LGBTQ person. So we do a lot of different things.
You do so many, I know, you do so many different things, and I know that that's not the whole list.
Yes.
Yeah, but to go back to the summit, because I think that sort of is your flagship event. Can you give us a picture of it? Because you say it's a couple days, so it's a group of people coming together in one place, and I think you use the Montessori grounds.
Yeah, for the past couple of years, we've been at Hilltop Montessori School, which has been a really excellent location for us. Actually, one of our board members who attended in the past said, this space is so beautiful, and it feels really important for LGBTQ people to be in a space that's really dignified and feels really nice, and that felt really important for her. So we've been up there for the past couple years. We've done it at the Broadbrook Grange in Guilford, which is a space I would love for us to be back in again. Just the history of granges in rural communities feels so important, and being able to utilize that space. Yeah. And they've just done such a great remodel there, updated the bathrooms. And anyway, we love the Broadbrook Grange. And yeah, so it's 2.5 days. Last year we added a third full day of programming on Friday. For things that we have called Friday field trips. So it's people come here from all over the U.S. Last year, people joined us from West Virginia, Oregon, California, New Jersey, every state in New England. People who are just really seeking rural LGBTQ community, and it's few and far between.
So you've got a little niche going on there, right?
Yeah. When we started having this focus for our work about 5 years ago, we were, if you would Google rural and queer or rural LGBTQ, it was, there's one book by this author, Mary Gray, that is maybe called Queering the Countryside that would come up. There's a great organization that's based in the South called Southerners on New Ground that's been doing this work for a long time. This wonderful project called Country Queers that's based in West Virginia. Actually, we had them come up and do a full day oral history project at our summit last year. So it was, very few groups at that time in 2014 that had this kind of focus. Yeah. And we remain one of very few groups nationally who are doing this kind of work. Yeah.
One thing I think is that, we've got language. We've got a shift in language going on, and it's affecting all of us. And I think that, I notice it growing, and certainly LGBTQ, each one of those words connotes a certain thing. But my understanding is that the word queer kind of is more of an umbrella. Is that correct?
Well, ask 5 different people, get 7 different answers, right? I think queer is a word that means a lot to me, and that feels like it is a fit for my own personal identity. Certainly not everyone feels that way. And not everyone feels the way about it being an umbrella. I think for a lot of people, especially older folks who are in the community, that was a very hurtful word.
Yeah, that's true.
People that are in their 30s and 40s, folks more around my age, there was a really strong reclaiming in the 90s and early 2000s, and that word feels very political and really important for folks. There's people who are younger that are using all kinds of different words like pansexual that feel like more of a fit. I think queer is still an umbrella term, and part of me is like, oh, am I just getting old and I don't want to let go of this yet? So, we have been really intentional about mostly we use LGBTQ in our work because we want it to feel like a place that's for everyone as much as possible. Right. And
something that everyone can understand, even if they don't know exactly what each of those letters means. Yeah. They know that it's representing a community. And what about pronouns? Pronouns are tough.
They can be. They can be very easy.
Let's hear about it.
Yeah, well, I think, in your introduction, you used my pronouns, which are they, them, and their. I think it's, in media, it's often a battle for me personally and for many other people that use all kinds of pronouns to be, represented as your truest form of yourself in media. The Commons actually is really wonderful at this. They've been very open and supportive, and one of the early media outlets in this community that's been really good about doing that. And, we've seen that change in the last few years. I think now the AP... that's in their style guides that you can use they and them, and that's what they recommend if that's what folks use. So, I'm glad that there has been a growth in usage for people of they and them as a singular pronoun. But I think that there was also I grieve some loss of creativity. Even 10 or 15 years ago, there were people who were using all kinds of different things. Yes. And now it seems like it's been flattened, which is nice, but also,
neutral makes so much sense. I mean, think about the language French, Spanish, when tables and chairs are feminine or masculine. What are they going to do?
Yeah. Well, and I think there's also a common misconception that this is new. We know that people have been using they and them for single individuals, for centuries. Really? So a lot of these things are returning too.
Yeah, and I know that you've done some studying of history when it comes to the LGBTQ community, our communities over the course of time.
Yes.
Yes.
I love history.
Yeah.
And it's so important. I think, I was having a conversation this morning with some folks about our community's history and how it's so easy to erase people. And I think it's really important to continue saying, LGBTQ people have always been here as long as there have been people. And can we find those instances throughout history that demonstrate that? We were just talking, language is constantly evolving all the time. And so that, I think, that's a real conversation of what words are we putting on top of other people's identities. Mm-hmm. Would they have used those words for themselves if they lived in this present time? We have no way of knowing. But I think it's safe to say that there are people who have, in the usage of trans as an umbrella term, or, people who have been having trans and or gender variant experiences for all of history. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And do you see it as an evolution over time?
I think people are now more able to find safety in being out as their selves. Mm-hmm. So I think we've come a long way, but we certainly have a long way to go, as with all things. Yeah.
But it's out. So much is out in the open, which you've certainly used that phrase.
Yeah.
But I think that it's something now that is part of our circumstances and part of our experiences, and so it's finding a way to bring that into our communities as well. So an organization like yours, that's what your focus is.
Yeah.
One of your focuses.
Yeah, I mean, we're really interested in connecting, and I think especially in rural places, people can be so incredibly isolated from each other. The internet has been a great blessing and a curse, I think, for our community. There's so many people who now have a tool to learn and connect with people that they wouldn't otherwise, but also, there's also a lot of misinformation out there.
Of course. One thing you said that really struck me in talking about all of this is that everyone's needs are real. And I think that's something that is good to remember. And how do you see that?
Yeah, I think it can be really easy to invalidate people and to disbelieve people. And I think if we're starting from, actually, it's the Brattleboro Community Justice Center is right across the hall from where we are. And I think I've learned a lot from restorative justice communities about talking about needs-based work. And I think if you're starting from that place, it's a lot less easy to judge. We talk about compassion in this town all the time. And I think starting from a place of looking at what is it that people need, either as individuals or on the community level, and starting from that place makes it a lot easier to have compassion for people. Yeah.
And also in terms of making assumptions or categorizing, we're always losing a little piece of our humanity as well.
Yeah.
And we do that all the time. We do it without thinking.
Right.
So
Right.
To be apprised of different, to hear people's stories, right? It makes such a big difference in where they came from.
Yeah, I was talking to someone before the select board elections this year, and we were, I'm like, oh, am I going to take us down this road? We were talking about people asking for money on the street, and this person was having some pushback, essentially about, permissiveness of people being able to do that. And this phrase, like, everyone's needs are real, comes up a lot for me in that kind of a conversation. Because people are just trying to meet their need for all kinds of things. And I think having a phrase like that in mind helps me be free of judgment about what that person's need is. Because it actually doesn't matter. Right. I think everyone's need, and everyone in our communities, all of their needs should be met all the time. And I think we can do that.
One other thing that you mentioned was that there's so much more visibility now about LGBTQ community, and that is beneficial in so many ways. And on the other hand, it poses other problems.
Yeah. So now, I mean, I think about that a lot, especially in relation to trans people and trans community. March 31st of every year is a national day that folks call Trans Day of Visibility. And a conversation that we have a lot at Green Mountain Crossroads is, there's been a really sharp rise in visibility for trans people in the last several years. But it becomes a problem when that rise in visibility is not also accompanied by a rise in access to resources and power. Right. And so I think that's when it can get dangerous for people. There's a lot more folks out there now that even know trans people exist. And so it can really put communities under a microscope in a really different way. Folks who are already at risk of not being safe everywhere they want to go, and that just can make things a lot more challenging.
And we're a small community, and everybody's part of the community.
Right.
You know, I think I say that on almost every show when I'm talking to people. You know, to realize, oh yes, you're in this community too.
Yeah.
You know, and you're part of it. And there's no way that we can marginalize,
right.
you know, any one group. Let's go back.
Great.
Let's go back to Green Mountain Crossroads and talk a little bit about. You have so many different projects, but the Andrews Inn project is an interesting one, and it's one that I think a lot of us older people will relate to as well.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite things that we've ever done. So the Andrews Inn, for folks who are not familiar, was a gay bar, community space, co-counseling site, disco, hotel. That catered to the LGBTQ community, but was really open for the whole community. That was in Bellows Falls from 1973 to 1984. And we initially got interested in the story of Andrews Inn after hearing whispers and, you know, rumors for years that this place existed, but couldn't find any information about it on the internet, the place that everyone looks for information. There was one interview that folks from the Pride Center of Vermont had done a couple years prior that had a brief mention of it, but otherwise, no. You know, even on websites that were talking about the building where the Andrews Inn was, which is the Hotel Wyndham right on the square in Bellows Falls, had no, you know, would mention many other things that had happened in that building over the course of, you know, 100 years, but not the Andrews Inn. And we're very interested in, you know, LGBTQ history, of course, but especially in under-historicized parts of that history. And started a wonderful collaboration with folks at Vermont Performance Lab. Sarah Coffey, who's now in the state legislature, had been running that organization, and an artist that she'd been working with, Aine Gordon, who's a playwright based in New York, who also does a lot of work around LGBTQ history and hidden parts of community history. And so we co-taught a course with Kate Ratcliffe, who's a professor of American Studies, and Brenda Foley, who's a theater professor at Marlborough College, and the four of us put together this course looking at radical social movements of the 60s, 70s, 80s in southern Vermont.
Of which there were
which there were many, very many, yes. So a lot of our students looked at broader commune movements, back to the land folks coming here, the start of the Women's Freedom Center, you know, many of these movements. And one of our students started looking at Andrews Inn. Initially through this story from Eva Munden, who is an incredible person that lives in Putney, who had been a firefighter.
That's right, I forgot.
Yeah, at the Westminster Fire Department, and she was a part of the crew that was fighting the Star Hotel fire in 1981, and had this really incredible connection with the Andrews Inn, where you know the story that she tells is they're fighting this fire, and folks from the Andrews Inn, a wall was starting to collapse, and folks from the Andrews Inn pulled some of the firefighters to safety, and so hearing that story really initially got us interested in what is this place? Can we learn more about it? So we started interviewing more and more people over the course of about 2.5 years. We talked to 15 people who have been there. And it became so clear through talking to people that this place was really important, you know, people describing it as a refuge, as home, life-saving, just all of those kinds of words were coming up for people. And
I think that a lot of the reason there was so little to find is because there was so little that they put out into the public.
Right.
You know, they kept it pretty quiet.
Yeah.
And we had colors here.
Right.
Yeah. So you've looked into Brattleboro as well.
And Cahoots. And the Cattle Company, of course.
Yes.
But yeah, sounds like quite a thriving scene.
It's kind of amazing, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, and there's so many connections at Common Ground Restaurant, of course, to LGBTQ community and to Andrews Inn as well.
Yes. A lot of what we're talking about when it comes to the LGBTQ community has to do with identity, you know, and identifiers, and that word comes up a lot. And can you talk about that a little bit?
I think identity can be a real source of strength and unity for people. It can also be a real line in the sand for other people. And we spend a lot of time thinking about that in our work, and I think in broader community. And a lot of that time is spent in, what name are we using for this event? What name are we using for ourselves? Just wanting to cast a wide net that's not too wide. I think there increasingly are conversations about who is queer and who is this for and what's the power of being together with people that share an identity. And I think that kind of space is really important, not in an exclusive way. This came up actually after the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando. And that felt to me and to Green Mountain Crossroads as a space that felt really important just for LGBTQ people to be with each other and at least be able to take a breath together. And we were hearing from a lot of allies in the community that they were also, straight allies were also wanting space to be there. And we really held a line and said, we're going to do something that's just for our community right now. And here's why. We just need that to happen. And then we can move on and do something with everybody. So. Yeah, there's a lot about identity, but those are some things that come to mind.
Yeah, and to claim something too, right? Yeah.
Well, I think to claim something and also be claimed, you know, it feels powerful. I think for people who are often alone to feel part and be part of a community.
And to belong.
Yeah.
Yes. HB, in terms of the needs of your community, I know that you mentioned at one point midwifery and doulas.
Yeah, we've done, have started moving away from, but have taught for many years, workshops with midwives, doulas, and birth workers about working specifically with trans clients. And I think there is a pervasive, belief that is incorrect that trans people especially don't have reproductive rights or shouldn't or can't reproduce. And, we just need the right kind of care. And so we spend a lot of time talking with people about how to provide that kind of care. Yeah.
And so do you have a group of people? Are you connected with the hospital with that, or is it individuals?
It's primarily, when we've taught that in the past, it's been at Birthwise Midwifery School in Bridgeton, Maine, in connection with a midwife that we co-teach with. But we've done it for the Green River Doula Network down in Western Massachusetts. We've co-taught with Abby Manukin, who's a queer doula who is based here in Brattleboro. So there's a lot of different people that have been interested in that.
That sounds like a real service.
Yeah.
And something that's really needed.
Yeah.
In addition to Out in the Open Summit, you have Out in the Open Radio.
Yes,
too.
And this is a new project I'm very excited about. We're lucky to have WVEW community radio here in Brattleboro, and so we're on that every week, Mondays from 2 to 3 p.m. And again, for us, it's a really exciting way to be able to connect with rural LGBTQ people from across the country and to let people know what are the sounds, what are people thinking about, what kind of music are we making, all that kind of stuff.
So it's pretty broad then. It's music and interviews and...
Yes, well, and I've never done radio before. I've done a lot of other audio work, but never radio. And so we just started it in April of this year. And so the first few episodes have been primarily music while I learn how to use radio equipment. Yeah. But that's been really fun. There's a great local band here called Bad Weather Friend that just put out an album. So we did an interview and played a lot of songs from their album for one of the first shows. And we played songs from this great band, an album called Lavender Country that's actually from the 70s. That was the first ever that we know of gay-themed country album. So it's kind of everything, and we'll start having some more interviews and guests on the show next
That's
week.
very cool.
Yeah.
And then you can have your own show on VCTV.
Yes.
Right? You can think of a clever name for that. I'm sure that you could. That would be cool.
That
would be
cool.
very cool.
It would be cool.
I think, again, the idea that you are focusing on rural LGBTQ is really very interesting and kind of amazing. And I think it's really wonderful.
Well,
I think it's great you're in the community.
Thank you. And thanks for having me. It's been really fun.
It's been great having you on, HB.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks to all of you for joining us today. Again, we appreciate you tuning in, and we will be here again next week.